In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, God is one. Amen. Well, it's a beautiful morning here. Gone are all the terrible clouds and thunder and lightning and so on for the last few days. What a beautiful day. Lovely and sunny and warm, really quite warm. So that's very nice. Good morning, Helia. I hope your brother is getting on okay today. I've been keeping him in my mind for the last 24 hours. I hope things are going well there. Good morning, Joan. I was looking at your Instagram earlier on today, Joan, and looking at the cakes that you do. They are absolutely astonishing. Everything from very sugary looking donuts with huge amounts of jam within them, through to cinnamon buns, through to the most exquisite baptism and wedding cakes that I think I've ever seen in my entire life. That's wonderful. I'll put a little link, if you like, to them underneath here later on today. And Suzanne, good morning. I'm glad to hear your brother is improving here. Teresa, good morning. Joan also lives in a place given over to Saint Thecla or Takla in Lebanon as well. So that is wonderful. God does indeed love beauty, and your cakes are a work of art. And I'm sure that in eating them, one realizes what a great work of art and love they are too. Good morning, Beverly. Good morning, Ahmed. It's nice to see you yesterday. And the children as well. I hope it was nice for you also the rest of the day. Today tonight we'll have a divine liturgy for Saint Demetrius, who is a saint very special to me. The icon of Saint Demetrius and an icon of Saint Paul and an icon of the holy prophet Elias were the first three icons I ever bought. Demetrius number one, and in all sorts of interesting ways he has been important to me ever since. Anyway, there we go. So it'll be lovely to be able to serve a liturgy for him today. Tonight you've got a vigil, Joan. Excellent, for St. Demetrius. Well, pray for me. Tonight really, is the 27th anniversary of my ordination to the diaconate. I have to say that I didn't do much as a deacon. I was a deacon for exactly 2 weeks, during which time there was one service with no priest, and then I was then ordained a priest 2 weeks later. And I've always said the longer somebody remains a deacon, the better that person is likely to be as a priest. Well, you can all see this by the fact that I was only a deacon for a couple of weeks. There we go. Good morning, Natalia and Stella. Kalimera Sas. Blessed day to everybody. Amen. Now, let's crack on. 5 minutes into it already, and not a bed made or a baby bathed, as my mother used to say. Spiritually, anyway. So, chapter 14, verses 7 to 14. So Jesus told a parable. They're at a dinner party, or some sort of lunch party, something like that. And it has to be said, that the likelihood of it being a party that was memorable for lots of good reasons for the host is unlikely. I suspect he probably went off and gave the cat a good kicking afterwards. Poor old Tibbles. So he told a parable to those who were invited, when he noted how they chose the best places, saying to them, "When you are invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him. And he who invited you and him come and say to you, 'Give place to this man.' Then you begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down in the lowest place, so that when he who invited you comes, he may say to you, "Friend, go up higher." Then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Then he also said to him who invited him, "When you give a dinner or a supper, do not ask your friends, your brothers, your relatives, nor rich neighbors, lest they also invite you back and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you shall be repaid at the resurrection of the just." And there we go. These two parables together, and two sayings of the Lord to those that he's with, give us a real insight into the way that the kingdom of heaven is meant to work. If you get onto Google or Ecosia or DuckDuck or something like that, and type in Debrett's correct form, you will find there a book that I used to use a great deal at one stage in my life. I don't need it anymore, because I don't tend to deal with members of the nobility. But back then I did. And I needed to have a book like that at my side so that I could, address them correctly, because they were abundantly fussy, and secondly, sit them down in the right places at table. And when they moved from the drawing room into the dining room, they would stand in the right order to go in. What a what a nightmare all that sort of stuff was. Anyway, this is so that when they sat down at dinner or lunch, they would sit correctly next to the person they should be sitting next to, and in the right order. Okay, and they really found this to be terribly important. It was rather tricky when you discovered that a couple had different statuses. This only actually affects the situation if the woman has a higher status than her husband. So in her own right, she is several stages above her hubby. And I remember there was such a case where I was, and my goodness, one was not allowed to forget it. Anyway, essentially what happens is that the person nearest the host, the woman nearest the host, is the least important one, and the man nearest the host is the most important one, and the woman nearest the hostess is the most important one, and the man nearest the hostess is the least important one. And they go down the table like this all the way down. It's the same actually with clergy standing at the altar, and it should be the same with people receiving communion, which is why it is that if you go to somewhere like Greece or Russia, you'll see all the babies coming up for communion first, and then the very elderly people coming last. Ooh, you say that's interesting. Other way around. Yeah. So let's have a look at what the Lord is saying here, because this is why it is this happens in this way. Verse 8. When you are invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him. And he who invited you and him come and say to you, "Give place to this man." Then you'll begin with shame to take the lower place. Okay. So you do the opposite. You take the lower place, the lower seat. This is one of those cases where you really can't win, actually. Especially if we're doing this in church, everybody wants to push everybody else forward to be the higher and higher place. But there is actually a straightforward rule, and that is the patriarchs will go first in order of precedence. So the ecumenical patriarch first, followed by, I think, Antioch, then Alexandria, then Jerusalem, then all the other ones on top of that. And then you have archimandrites in order of them becoming archimandrites. Then you have hieromonks, so that's priests who are also monks. Then you'd have archpriests, then you'd have priests, then you'd have hierodeacons, that's deacons already monks, and then deacons, and so on, pottering off down the thing. And sometimes you you see people arguing about whether they should be lower, usually lower than the other one. Oh, please stand higher than I am. And also, you find this also in clergy. If clergy are eating together, so they've been invited to a wedding or something, where you find, let's say, I remember being invited, well, in Ballyman, something like that. You might have a bishop sitting in the centre, and then clergy in order going out, and then the lecturers and others as well. And it's just as well always to go to the lowest place there, and then you actually are invited up higher. Or, of course, quite rightly in my case, you're left where you are in the lowest place, in fact, possibly even forced onto the floor. Now, there's a reason for all of this. So take the lower seat. If it is your seat where you deserve to be and should be, well, that's well and good. If not, well, you'll be brought up higher. St. Basil said, don't force the lowest seat on yourself in a display of false humility. And he also said to the hosts that it's their duty to seat the guests in proper order. So there's no embarrassment, everybody comes in and they sit where they're meant to sit. Okay? He also said, resistance or opposition to where you should sit is a far stronger token of pride than taking the first seat. Now, I remember on one of the parish feasts, one of the early ones, I said to everybody can sit wherever they wish. And I then discovered that I had been given the seat in the very centre of the table with people radiating out from me. And I was about to complain about this when somebody said to me, no, Father, you need to sit there, because then everybody knows where you are and everybody can then coordinate with you. You're where you should be. So I now do that, and it's the right thing to do. That isn't actually what the Lord did, and I'll explain about that in a moment. Now, verses 10 and 11. I'm not giving everybody church etiquette, by the way. This is not important. Verses 10 and 11. But when you are invited, go and sit down the lowest place, so that he who invited you comes to say to you, go up higher. Then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at table with you. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Well, it's up to the Lord, who is the person, who is the host at the feast, to decide who goes up higher. Okay? And we find this in receiving Holy Communion. You know how it is. If you go to church, Joan will see this evening, then if there's a bishop there or bishops there, then they will receive communion first. Then the priests will all receive communion. Then the deacons will all receive communion. In the old days, the deacons received communion absolutely after everybody else had received, and in fact only by cleaning out the cup and the viscos. They licked out the remains, as it were, and in that way they received communion. So that's because they were in inverted commas, they were the servants. Deacons are servants, but actually all the clergy are servants. Now it's been changed. So you would get the patriarch, then the bishop, then metropolitans, bishops, archimandrites, and all those guys are receiving communion. And then, if you look, you have the babies come and receive next, then working up through young people, then slightly older people, until you get to the oldest within the congregation. In other words, normally in a village where it's an Orthodox village, you have people in order of baptism, with those who were baptized a long time ago receiving last, and those who are baptized today receiving first. And then the clergy ahead of them. The idea of this being quite clearly that the clergy are less important than the babies. So the patriarch receives before the babies. All the other, grandees of the church, they receive before the deacons receive, and the deacons receive before the babies. So the babies are more important than any of them, and then it works out through the age of the people in church until you get to the grandparents and great-grandparents. So you have this sort of the opposite of what you might expect. And that's why it's done in that sort of way. You also have within, I can't remember what I was going to say. Okay, so that's the way that is there. Be interesting to have seen in this particular supper that we're dealing with here, where the host put the Lord. Did he place him at his own right-hand side, or did he put the Lord in his rightful place as the host of the banquet or the supper? Because in the end, the Lord, of course, is the most important person, or did he sit him right at the very bottom? It'd be interesting to find out. Anyway, the whole of this story is meant to bring to mind, our minds, the whole business of the heavenly banquet, and we should not exalt ourselves. I'm going to show you, there's a very interesting thing. When you read carefully the account of the Lord's Supper, where the Lord takes the bread and the wine and blesses them and makes them into his body and blood, there's some interesting things within there, aren't there? And one of the interesting things is that one of the youngest of the whole people is sitting next to him, and the glorious apostle Peter has to signal to St. John rather, to ask him who is going to betray him. Peter cannot ask directly, which means that Peter is not sitting next to the Lord. Now you'd expect that to be the case. You would expect them to be sitting in age order with the most important right up next to the Lord. But instead, it looks as if the Lord is sitting amongst the kids, amongst John, who is a youngster. Now, if you look at an icon of the Lord's Supper, here we have one. You have the Lord in the middle, and here we have John, and then next to him, you have St. Peter as well. And that's odd, because Peter would simply be able to ask the Lord directly. And then, as you can see, you've got the younger apostles at the sides here, and the older ones up near the top, except for John, who's sitting next to the Lord. Now, that would make sense, except you'd expect him to be somewhere down here. That would make sense at most banquets. But the fact that only John, who's one of the youngsters, could speak to the Lord makes it appear as if when the Lord had finished washing everybody's feet, he went and he sat at the bottom of the table rather than at the top. And therefore, the first people to receive communion would have been the kids, the boys, sitting around him, and then the middle-aged disciples, and then the older ones last. And it rather appears as if this is, in other words, an opposite order of precedence. If you look at the breadths, you'll find an order of precedence, which would start with the king, and then the Archbishop of Canterbury, then the Queen, and then all the other nobility and so on. And end up somewhere 60 million people later, people like me. Okay, so the Lord has himself almost certainly swapped around the normal order of precedence, putting himself, God, at the bottom of the table. And it's a good thing for everybody who is important, in inverted commas, in the church, to remember that if God put himself at the bottom of the list, then they should try their best to put themselves as close to the bottom as they're able to do. Okay? So though you might be sitting at the high table, in some places I've been shoved into a high table where I'm the only person there, sitting in bored grandeur, while everybody else seems to be having a whale of a time beyond me, and a couple of deacons serving me food, whilst I have to sit all by myself. Everybody else thoroughly enjoying the lunch or the dinner. Anyway, there we go. All right, so that's some of that. He who humbles himself will be exalted. And the same is going to happen at the end. But there's nothing we can say to God about anything we could possibly have done for him that will bring us any honor beyond, well, you only did what I told you to do. So you died for me? Well, of course, that's what you should do. So you spent your entire life as my priest? Well, why not? That's what you should do. So you gave up everything, became a nun living in a cave. What's so great about that? So you are the great eminence, the holy patriarch himself. Yes, well, that was your job. That's what you were expected to do. No great shakes as far as God is concerned. Then, verse 12, he, Jesus, also said to him who invited him, so he's talked so far to the guests, and now he's going to talk to the host. And in every party, you have these two groups of people. You have the host family, and you then have the guests. And the host family in heaven, of course, is God. And the guests is everybody else. And who is the Lord going to invite to his own party, to the great feast in the kingdom of heaven? Then he also said to him who invited him, when you give a dinner or a supper, do not ask your friends, your brothers, your relatives, nor rich neighbors, lest they also invite you back and you be repaid. That's normal, isn't it? Somebody invites you and you invite them back. You give and you get. That is a normal sort of activity about hospitality, unfortunately. St. Theophylact says, the inviter and the invited make up the two groups, and now we have the Lord talking to the invited. And he is inviting them to a selfless generosity. St. John Chrysostom says, let us not bestow kindness on others under the hope of return, for this is a cold motive. St. Gregory of Nyssa says, do not let the poor lie in obscurity, as if they're worth nothing. Reflect on who they are, and you'll discover how precious they are. Okay? And that's the next bit. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, and the blind. Now that list is quite interesting. All but one of them come from the Qumran scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, where there's a list that particular group made of all the people who are not going to come into the kingdom of heaven and eat at the heavenly banquet. And they were the blind, the lame, the maimed, those people crushed hands, crushed feet, those people who could not hear, could not see, and so on. All of those people, and also people who were, what's the word now, who had lost their mind, become senile and so on. These people were outside. But Luke says, the Lord is saying, actually, those are the people who do make up the kingdom of heaven. And he then adds on top of that, the poor. And that's interesting, because quite frequently you find that the children of Israel are called the poor, but now Luke is obviously adding to this poor all of these other people as well. And the church itself was known as God's little ones, God's poor ones. So they're the ones who are invited. But when you give a feast, invite all those people who have absolutely no hope at all of paying you back. Okay? They have no choice at all about that. Okay? So anybody afflicted in the flesh, forbidden banquet in the kingdom of heaven. But St. Luke makes it clear the Lord completely reverses this. And you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. So God will bless those people when you give hospitality, generosity to those people who cannot repay. But at the resurrection, God will recompense you. And that is a way of finding yourself accidentally further up the order of precedence. Though that's not why one should do that sort of thing. Okay, so quite an interesting thing that. The Lord must have been quite embarrassing. It's going to get even worse, actually. The Lord is going to tell another parable at this ill-fated dinner party, where they invited him not because they wanted God to be with them on the Sabbath, but because they wanted to trick him and find him out and do horrible things to him as a result. And the Lord then speaks to the host and says, we want generosity out of you. He speaks to the guests and says, and from you, we need humility. And then we discover from that the humility of Christ and also the generosity of God. Okay. Let's see then what people are saying. I think I said all the way down to Stella saying Kalimera, Natalia, Metropolitan Anthony Bloom dispensing with all the official honours to your bishop, remaining very approachable and at the same time very impressive. He would walk about like some lowest member of clergy, if not lowest member of the church staff, but encountering him was always special. Yes, somebody was telling me a little while ago that on one occasion, somebody came to the door of the church and obviously thought that he was the janitor and talked to him in a very sort of negative sort of way. It was only much later that he discovered that this, in fact, was Metropolitan Anthony. My own previous patriarch, Ignatius IV of Antioch, the first time I met him, I didn't know who he was, and I thought that he was a deacon. I'd just been ordained priest. I thought he was a deacon, elderly deacon, and he was sort of peeling me apples and giving me fruit and chatting to me about my parish in a really lovely way. And what surprised me was how much this elderly deacon knew about me and knew about my parish. And then discovered later that he happened to be the patriarch, feeling a little bit, more than a little bit embarrassed as a result. But actually, I think he probably quite liked it because he was very low-key. I remember him saying that he didn't enjoy being shoved into this posh hotel. So why didn't you just get me somewhere that's clean and tidy? So it didn't need to have this, really expensive hotel to stay in. And he then invited me, and I was very young back then, to go and stay with him in Damascus. It was the first time, since I was a child, that I'd been to Damascus. And there, when I arrived, Sayyidina came and checked my room. and looked around and decided that as an Englishman, I needed tea with milk and biscuits and fruit and some fresh soap. And he went off, and I expected the housekeeper to come back, but 20 minutes later or so, the patriarch himself came back with a tray with tea and milk and soap. Maybe I stunk like a ferret, and apples and stuff, which he then brought into my room and potted around, sort of putting them out and filling up the kettle with water, thinking, this is how a bishop should be. Mind you, there's not much that anybody in these islands can learn from anybody in the Middle East about hospitality. If you want to know what hospitality is like, then go to Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iran. I've been in all those places. They knock anything that we'll do into a cocked hat, to the point for an English person of deep embarrassment. Frey was reading about this earlier tonight. It must be nighttime, is it? For us this morning. Stella says the patriarch came to 12 apostles yesterday. The priest came in and out in definite hierarchical order. Well, that goes back to that Jewish story, doesn't it, about the, well, I told it the other day. But yeah, if you want to look for humility, then don't look amongst the clergy. Beverly says, Archbishop Gregorius asked me if he could sit in the chair I was in, daydreaming. I shot out so fast, he thought it very funny. Does this apply to relationships between a man and a wife? No. Not in the question that you've asked it. A wife ought to always give, not expecting that much in return. No. Each of you should entertain the other as if the other is in fact Christ himself. It's like, if you notice, the husband and wife in the Orthodox Church are equally crowned. Both are crowned. Then each are crowned with the other one's crown. Both receive rings. Each one is ringed with the other one's ring. Each one are given specific duties within the service, but is made quite clear that there is an absolute equality between the two. St. Paul, when he was writing about the relationship between men and women in marriage, was unbelievably, for those times, forward in his thinking. The way that he described how a man and a wife should react towards each other was astonishing, because back in those days, a woman was simply the property of her husband. And to make it quite clear that they were indeed one flesh in God. That if the husband had duties towards his wife in the same way as the wife had duties towards the husband, was revolutionary. And we tend to forget that. And we should always be at the very cutting edge of revolutionary thought, instead of which, with a small c, we tend to be extremely conservative and fall into habits and so on that are anything but revolutionary, are staid and old-fashioned in a way that is not actually of the gospel. Okay, so what should a wife expect from her husband? She should expect every ounce of his being directed towards her, and same the other way around. If that happens, then actually everything else within the family will actually work out properly, because they'll become the king and queen, the martyrs towards each other, and they'll also be the head of the family together, and there will be the center of the prayerful community, which includes the children, so like an abbot and abbess over their family, spiritual directors and counselors and protectors of their own family. And in that way, they also become a mini church within there. That's why it's always a good thing to have a priestly family at the centre of parishes. My parish suffers because I am not married and have no children, and therefore they don't have at the centre a priestly family at the centre of the parish. And that then is iconographic of the way the whole parish should be. Okay. Good morning, Matthew. I hope your first day at work went well, and that you will be a blessing to them and they to you. Hemlock Hedge. Don't know what you said, but it's disappeared. That's a great handle, isn't it? Hemlock Hedge. Deeply poisonous. When I was in the monastery, lots of hemlock grew around there. Interesting stuff. Okay, so please remember to pray. Been thinking about you, Matthew, and praying for you and hoping that all goes well. And for Philip, obviously we're praying. For Judy, we pray. And for, I'll just go back to my list here. These ones, Igor, we continue to pray. And for another child, we're praying as well. But I don't know her name, so I'm just asked me to pray for them. And for Igor, and for Brenda, for her goodness, and George. And for Lewis, we continue to pray. And for Mr. Esther, continue to pray for him. And for Lynette, Susan's Lynette, and Thecla's mother Carol, and for Humphrey's Mary, for Stella's Belen and Anne. I hope they're getting on okay, Stella. And for Erin's Joseph, we continue to pray. For Anton, who died about several years ago now, 4 years ago probably. And if you pray also for Tony, who's travelling down to Cornwall today or tomorrow for his brother's funeral, for his safety as well. Martha and Jonah expecting twins any day. Woohoo! Oh gosh, their life won't be the same after that. God bless them. It's a blessing, but it's a tricky blessing, that one. Father Tim and Sue, yes, you are indeed. They are wonderful. Pray for them as well. Okay, remember to pray for each other and have a wonderful day today and tonight and tomorrow. Joan, I hope you have a wonderful vigil for St. Demetrius and a great St. Demetrius' Day tomorrow as well. Your prayers. God willing, tomorrow. On the other hand, I might take the day off to enjoy this, but I think I'll do this. Right, bye-bye.